Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're heading back in time to ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy.
And buckle up, because we're not just dusting off old history books. We're about to uncover some surprisingly relevant lessons from Athenian democracy. Lessons for leadership, decision-making, and even just navigating the ups and downs of our modern world.
Okay, you've definitely got my attention.
Yeah.
Athenian democracy. It's one of those things we all learned about in school, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the details. So before we dive into the nitty-gritty, can you set the scene for us?
Imagine a society where power is like a family heirloom, passed down through generations of elite families. We're talking about the aristocracy here.
Right, the Athenian 1%, they were running the show, weren't
Yeah,
they?
we're controlling the land, the wealth, the laws, pretty much everything.
Sounds a bit like a recipe for revolution, right?
Exactly. And that's precisely what was brewing in ancient Athens. This concentration of power, coupled with a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, created what I like to call a pressure cooker of social tension.
So Athens was basically a powder keg waiting to explode. What was the tipping point?
Well, the ruling class wasn't entirely oblivious. They knew they needed to change course, which is where a pivotal figure named Solon enters the picture.
Solon, wasn't he some kind of wise sage or something?
He was a respected statesman, appointed in 594 BCE with a seemingly impossible task: avert disaster.
No pressure then. So what did Solon do?
Here's where it gets interesting. Solon didn't try to stage a complete political revolution overnight. Instead, he focused on strategic incremental reforms, addressing the most urgent issues, the things causing the most immediate suffering.
The classic triage approach. Stabilize the patient before attempting major surgery. So what were some of Solon's key moves?
One of his boldest moves was abolishing debt slavery.
Debt slavery, that sounds pretty rough.
It was. Before this, if you couldn't pay your debts, you could literally become the property of the person you owed money to, trapped in a cycle of poverty and powerlessness.
It's like hitting the reset button on a whole segment of society. Give people a chance to rebuild their lives and contribute to the economy without this burden hanging over their heads.
That's the kind of thinking that true leaders embody. Solon wasn't just putting a band-aid on a gaping wound, he was addressing a root cause of suffering and instability.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the most impactful solutions aren't about quick fixes, but about addressing the systemic issues holding people back.
Exactly. But Solon didn't stop there. He also recognized that tying political power solely to lineage was inherently unstable.
In other words, it's not what you know, but who you're related to.
Pretty much. So he restructured the political system to be based on wealth instead of birth.
Not perfect, but definitely a step towards a more meritocratic system.
Exactly. It wasn't a perfect meritocracy by any means, but it did open up opportunities for people who weren't born into the right families to have a voice and potentially rise through the ranks.
Creating pathways for upward mobility. I like it. So Solon comes in, puts out the immediate fire with his reforms, but what about that whole democracy thing?
Well, perhaps his most significant reform, in terms of its long-term impact, was establishing a new assembly called the Ecclesia.
Okay, the ecclesia, I've heard of this. This was a big deal.
Huge. For the first time in Athenian history, ordinary citizens had a formal platform for participating in government.
Hold on, are we talking about a society where for centuries decisions were made behind closed doors by a tiny elite, and suddenly there's this space where ordinary people can potentially influence the course of their city?
You got it.
That's radical.
Absolutely. Now, it's important to note that the Ecclesia wasn't a perfect representation of Athenian society. The wealthiest citizens still held a disproportionate amount of influence.
Right, because even in ancient Athens, money talked.
It always does. But the Ecclesia represented a shift, however small, towards a more inclusive form of governance. It was a crack in the foundation of the old power structures.
So, Solon planted the seeds for something much bigger, but Athens still wasn't a full-blown democracy at this point.
Not yet. That transformation, the one that would really shake up the ancient world, that's where Cleisthenes comes in.
Cleisthenes, the father of democracy. Everyone learned his name in school, but to be honest, I need a refresher on what he actually did.
Yeah.
What were Cleisthenes' big moves, and how did they set the stage for Athenian democracy as we know it?
Well, Cleisthenes, he was a true revolutionary. He wasn't interested in just tweaking the existing system. He wanted a complete overhaul.
Now, that's what I call a vision for change. What was he hoping to achieve?
Cleisthenes had this radical idea that all free male citizens should have an equal say in how their city was run, regardless of their wealth or family name.
Okay, I can see why they call him the father of democracy.
But this was a direct challenge to the Athenian aristocracy. They believed power was their birthright.
Right, because up until then, it pretty much had been.
Exactly. So Cleisthenes knew that to empower the people, he first had to dismantle the systems that kept the aristocracy in power.
So how'd he do it? Did he just, like, kick them all out of Athens?
Not quite. His strategy was much more clever. He completely reorganized Athenian society.
Reorganized it how?
He divided the population into what were called demenes.
Deans, refresh my memory. What were those again?
Think of them as local districts, geographically based, kind of like tribes that cut across those old family lines.
Oh, okay.
This forced people from different social classes to work together, diluting the power of any single family.
That is some seriously savvy political maneuvering. He basically leveled the playing field.
Exactly. And this restructuring went hand in hand with his most impactful move, empowering the assembly, the ecclesia, to be the true heart of Athenian democracy.
So Solon creates the ecclesia, and Cleisthenes turns it into the main governing body.
Right. Cleisthenes made the ecclesia the central decision-making body of Athens. Citizens could directly debate, propose laws, and crucially vote on matters that affected the entire city.
Okay, now we're talking. But I'm guessing there's more to the story, right?
Oh, there's always more. This was a radical experiment. New systems, even with the best intentions, always have a way of throwing curveballs.
All right, you've piqued my curiosity.
Yeah.
What else did Cleisthenes put into place?
Well, for one, he established the bull,
The bull.
or as it was also known as, the Council of 500.
Okay.
The bull played a crucial role in setting the agenda for the assembly and taking on the day-to-day business of governing.
So kind of like a cabinet, or?
In a way, yes. But the way they chose members of the bull, that's where things get really fascinating.
All right, spill the Athenian tea. How did they choose who got to be on this powerful council?
Are you ready for this? They used a system called sortition.
Sortition, that sounds awfully
Right,
random.
because it was random. They literally drew names by lot.
Wait, seriously? They'd pick their city council members' names out of a hat.
You got it.
I mean, it's certainly one way to ensure equal opportunity in government, but what was the thinking behind this lottery system?
It all goes back to that core principle of preventing any single group from holding too much power. By randomly selecting citizens for the bull, Cleisthenes ensured that it wasn't just the wealthy or well-connected who had a say in running the city. It was a radical experiment in giving ordinary people a shot at leadership.
This is blowing my mind. We're talking about a system designed to distribute power as widely as possible.
Exactly.
That's a concept that still feels incredibly relevant today, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. But before we get too carried away with how ahead of their time the Athenians were, let's talk about another one of Cleisthenes' innovations, ostracism.
Ostracism. Now, that one I do remember. Wasn't that where they'd banish someone from Athens for like 10 years if they were deemed a threat?
You got it. It sounds harsh, but they saw it as a crucial safety mechanism for their young democracy. The idea was to prevent tyranny, to ensure that no one individual, no matter how popular or powerful, could accumulate enough influence to undermine the system.
I mean, it's a pretty drastic measure, exiling someone for a decade just because they were a bit too popular or persuasive.
It was a different time. But the Athenian experiment, its triumphs and its inevitable missteps, offers a treasure trove of lessons for us to unpack.
Okay, so we've got these big moves. Restructuring Athenian society, empowering the assembly, randomly selecting leaders, and even that slightly terrifying system of ostracism. But how did everyday Athenians actually experience this democracy?
Well, imagine a system where you, as a citizen, have the right to attend assembly meetings, which, by the way, could be quite frequent and directly participate in debates on everything from going to war to how taxes should be spent.
It's like the ultimate town hall meeting, but with actual decision-making power.
Exactly.
But I imagine that level of direct democracy had its own set of challenges. How did they handle disagreements? Or prevent things from devolving into chaos?
Those are great questions. And they lead us to some of the most important and perhaps cautionary tales from Athenian democracy.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me everything.
It was a system that could be both remarkably effective and surprisingly fragile, often at the same time.
Okay, so paint me a picture of Athenian democracy in action. What was it like to be a citizen in ancient Athens, navigating this new world of civic engagement and shared responsibility?
Imagine this. You're an Athenian citizen, and it's just another day ending in "aly," which means...
It's time for another assembly meeting.
You got it. You head to the Phoenix, a hill in Athens, and find yourself among hundreds, sometimes thousands, of your fellow citizens.
Wow, talk about a direct democracy. No absentee ballots or electoral colleges here. What was the vibe like at these gatherings? Was it all serious debate and political maneuvering, or was there a more, shall we say, spirited atmosphere?
It was lively, to say the least. Imagine a mix of a town hall meeting, a political rally, and maybe even a bit of a street festival thrown in. There were speeches, heckling, debates that could get quite heated. Remember, these were passionate people who believed their voices truly mattered. And they weren't just deciding on big picture things like war and peace, they were voting on everyday matters, like the price of grain or the maintenance of public works.
It's both exhilarating and slightly terrifying to imagine.
Ah,
But that's the thing about giving people a voice, right? You never know what they're going to say or how forcefully they're going to say it. But I'm guessing it wasn't all shouting matches and chaos.
uh-huh.
They must have had some system for making decisions right. Otherwise, nothing would ever get done.
You're absolutely right. For all its raucous energy, Athenian democracy was surprisingly structured. They had a system for introducing proposals, debating them, and ultimately putting them to a vote.
Okay, walk me through it. Let's say I'm an Athenian citizen with a brilliant idea for a new law. How do I get my proposal in front of the assembly and, hopefully, make Athenian history?
Well, first, you'd need to get your proposal onto the assembly's agenda, which was no small feat in itself. This is where the bull, the Council of 500, came in. Remember, they were responsible for the day-to-day running of the city and had a lot of influence over what the assembly actually discussed.
So the bull was like a filter, deciding which issues were important enough to merit the assembly's attention. I bet that led to some interesting political maneuvering behind the scenes.
Oh, undoubtedly. But let's say your proposal was deemed worthy and made it onto the agenda. Now it was time to face the assembly itself.
Time to polish up my public speaking skills. So I'm standing there in front of hundreds of my fellow citizens trying to convince them that my idea for, I don't know, a new aqueduct or a tax on olive oil is the best thing since sliced bread. What happens next?
This is where the Athenian system of direct democracy really comes to life. You, as the proposer of the motion, would have a chance to make your case, laying out your arguments and trying to persuade your fellow citizens of the merits of your idea.
I'm guessing this is where those legendary Athenian rhetorical skills came into play.
Absolutely. Being a persuasive speaker was a highly valued skill in Athenian society, and for good reason. The power of your arguments, the clarity of your logic, and even your charisma could mean the difference between your proposal being hailed as a stroke of genius and, well...
And it being laughed out of the assembly.
Exactly.
Okay, so I've made my impassioned plea for why not a tax on olive oil? What happens next? Do we all just throw our sandals in the air to vote?
Not quite. Once you've made your case, there's an opportunity for debate. Any citizen, and I mean a all-wise citizen, could speak up, either to support or oppose your proposal.
Talk about a true test of an idea having to stand up to scrutiny and challenges from all sides. It's kind of like the ultimate peer review process, except instead of journal articles, we're debating the future of Athenian society.
Exactly. And just like in a good peer review, the goal was to test the strength of an idea, to identify its flaws and potential unintended consequences.
So I'm imagining a lively back and forth with people from all walks of life weighing in, sharing their perspectives, and trying to poke holes in each other's arguments.
You're getting the picture. It was a process that could be messy, unpredictable, and sometimes downright frustrating. But it was also a testament to the power of collective deliberation, of bringing together diverse viewpoints to hammer out the best possible course of action.
It sounds both exhilarating and exhausting at the same time. But ultimately, a decision had to be made. How did they go from this raucous debate to a final verdict?
Well, once the debate had run its course, they'd put the proposal to a vote. And unlike some of our more complicated electoral systems today, Athenian democracy was all about simplicity.
Keep it simple, Athens. I like it. So how did they actually vote?
They used a show of hands. The majority ruled, and whatever they decided became the law of the land, or in this case, the city.
There's something so straightforward, so purely democratic about a system where a show of hands can determine the course of a society.
There's a certain elegance to it, isn't there? But of course, no system is without its flaws.
That's what I'm dying to dig into. We've talked about the ideals of Athenian democracy, the mechanisms of how it functioned, but what about the reality? Were there times when this system, for all its good intentions, went off the rails?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, some of the most important lessons we can learn from Athenian democracy come from its failures, not just its successes.
Okay, let's talk about those failures. What were some of the ways Athenian democracy went wrong, and what can we learn from those missteps?
One of the most glaring flaws, of course, was the exclusion of women, slaves, and foreigners from citizenship and therefore from any form of political participation.
It's a stark reminder that even the most progressive systems can be blind to their own biases and limitations. It makes you wonder if there are any systems of government that are truly immune to human fallibility, to the risks of manipulation, or just plain bad judgment.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that political philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. Athenian democracy, for all its flaws, offers us a cautionary tale about the importance of checks and balances, of ensuring that no single individual or even a majority can make rash decisions with disastrous consequences.
Checks and balances. That concept feels strangely familiar, like something I vaguely remember from a high school civics class.
Well, get ready for a refresher course because the Athenian experiment offers some surprisingly relevant insights into how to build systems that are both empowering and resilient. And perhaps even more importantly, it reminds us that no system, no matter how well-intentioned, can ever fully account for the complexities of human nature.
All right, you've officially piqued my curiosity. Let's delve into those lessons, both the inspiring and the cautionary, that we can take from Athenian democracy and apply to our modern world. Where do we even begin?
Let's start with a simple but powerful idea. Collective decision-making, while not without its challenges, has the potential to lead to far better outcomes than systems where power is concentrated in the hands of a few.
Makes sense. The more diverse perspectives you have at the table, the more likely you are to identify blind spots, challenge assumptions, and come up with solutions that work for a wider range of people.
Exactly. And Athenian democracy, for all its flaws, was a testament to the power of tapping into the collective wisdom of a community. They understood that no single individual, no matter how brilliant or well-intentioned, could ever possess a monopoly on good ideas.
So, lesson one, embrace collective decision-making, even if it means things get a little messy and complicated sometimes. What else can we learn from our Athenian friends?
This next one might seem obvious, but the Athenians learned it the hard way. Power must be distributed. Their entire system, from the way they structured their society to their use of sortition for selecting officials, was designed to prevent any single individual or group from accumulating too much power.
It's like they were the original champions for checks and balances.
Precisely. They understood that concentrated power, whether it's in the hands of a monarch, a dictator, or even a small group of elites, is a recipe for stagnation, corruption, and ultimately tyranny. By distributing power as widely as possible, they aimed to create a system that was more dynamic, more resilient, and more accountable to the people it served.
It's amazing how relevant those ideas feel, even today, when we're grappling with questions about who holds power, how decisions are made, and how we can ensure that our systems are truly representative and accountable.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that the pursuit of a more just and equitable society is an ongoing process, one that requires us to constantly examine our assumptions, challenge the status quo, and be willing to experiment with new ways of organizing ourselves.
You said there were a few key takeaways from the Athenian experiment. What's the final nugget of wisdom you'd leave us with?
This one's a bit more nuanced, but equally important. Even the most well-intentioned systems need safeguards. The Athenians were acutely aware of the potential for power to corrupt, even in a democracy.
Okay, so we've established that Athenian democracy had its share of safeguards. The bull, ostracism, that whole system of checks and balances they had going on. But those safeguards didn't always work as intended, did they?
You're absolutely right, and that's precisely the point. The Athenian experiment, for all its flaws, reminds us that building a better society is not a one-and-done deal. It's an ongoing process that requires constant vigilance, adaptation, and a willingness to learn from our mistakes.
So it's not enough to just design a system with good intentions. We have to be prepared to constantly evaluate how it's working, identify its weaknesses, and make adjustments along the way.
Exactly. And perhaps even more importantly, we have to cultivate a culture of civic engagement where people feel empowered to speak up, challenge the status quo, and hold their leaders accountable. Because ultimately, the success or failure of any system, whether it's a democracy or a business or even a family, depends on the active participation of those it's meant to serve.
That's a powerful thought. It's a reminder that building a better future isn't just about designing the right systems. It's about fostering a culture of engagement, critical thinking, and shared responsibility. So what does this all mean for us, the listeners, sitting here in the 21st century, centuries removed from those Athenian assemblies and debates?
It means that the spirit of Athenian democracy, that drive to create a more just and equitable society through collective action, is as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. It's a call to engage with the world around us, to participate in the decisions that affect our lives, and to never stop questioning how we can do better.
It's about taking those Athenian lessons to heart. The power of collective decision-making, the importance of distributing power, the need for safeguards and accountability, and the understanding that building a better future is an ongoing process that requires all of us to be engaged and informed.
Precisely. And if there's one final thought I could leave you with, it would be this: never underestimate the power of your own voice and your own actions to shape the world around you. Even small acts of citizenship, from attending a local council meeting to simply engaging in respectful dialogue with those who hold different views, can contribute to a more just and equitable society.
On that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. As always, a huge thank you to you, our amazing expert, for taking us on this journey through time and uncovering those timeless lessons from Athenian democracy. And to you, our listeners, thank you for joining us on this adventure in knowledge.
It's been my pleasure. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and stay curious.